We make out of the quarrel with others rhetoric, but of the quarrels with ourselves poetry. Hi, friends, this is a new lesson in our series Creative Writing Small Steps for Giant Leaps, and this is all about poetry writing, its types and terms. This is going to be a very interesting lesson because poetry is my personal favorite, and when I'll be venturing into poetry, I would definitely try my best to make it as concise and as elaborate as possible. It's presented by me, Palak Sharma. Few things about me: I'm an economics honors student, a content developer, a mixture of Keats and Shakespeare. That's how I like calling myself, a poet at heart and a theatre geek. Follow me on Unacademy. Here is my link. For doubt, feedback, queries, feel free to write in the comment section, and do not forget the 3 R's and the S. Rate, review, recommend, and share the lessons. Let the light shine. Now, we've all read poetry somewhere or the other. In schools, we were taught to read poetry, to recite poetry, to understand poetry. But many people do not like poetry from their young years. Maybe it is because the choice of poems in the educational system is not quite nice, or it's maybe unsuitable, or maybe it is because some people hate learning anything. Who knows? For my part, I wrote a lot of prose poetry a year or two ago. It wasn't typical poetry at all. Great poets are literally something different. Great poets like Robert Frost here in the picture, they have something to write about. They do not waste time hunting for rhymes and such stuff. Great poets use pictures in their poems. They make people imagine scenes. They convey the theme of their poems aptly and beautifully, and there's something really special about them. But what makes them special? We don't know that. Then Robert Frost defined poetry beautifully when he said that poetry is when an emotion has found its thought, and the thought has found words. Like when an emotion is getting to know its thoughts, then it's poetry. And when the thought has found its words, then it's poetry again. It's personified poetry. So, I was talking about the special poets. So, the question is, what makes them special? Are they God gifted, or do they learn poetry skill? I guess it is both. Let's look at the latter one, poetry writing skills. To acquire poetry writing skills, one must read and write poetry regularly. However, it also helps to know a few things about poetry, such as poetry writing forms or poetry writing types and things. So there are many types of poetry writing forms. A man could make himself hoarse shouting them, but still they would not be succinctly defined, explained, or illustrated. So this lesson is not meant as a complete guide on poetry writing forms. And I repeat it again, it is not a complete guide on poetry writing forms. Rather, it is just the introduction. So take it as something of a prelude to poetry writing. So the first form is sonnet. This type of poem has fallen out of favor now, but it's still my favorite type of poetry to read, and it follows a strict ABAB rhyme scheme. It was just made popular by Shakespeare. We have Death, Be Not Proud by John Donne. Shall I Compare Thee to a Summer's Day? This one is my favorite sonnet by William Shakespeare. We have I Carry Your Heart With Me, I Carry It in My Heart by E. E. Cummings, and lots more. Sonnet is seriously a very wide genre again, all thanks to Shakespeare. Then we have haiku. It's a type of popular Japanese poem. Modern haiku is different from the traditional Japanese haiku. The modern haiku follows a 575 syllable rhyming structure, and there are 18 syllables in total. A well-written haiku is lovely and pleasurable to read. For example, we have one here. A summer river being crossed, how pleasing, with sandals in my hands. Usually haiku are funny, so you'll always find a laughing element in a haiku. It's always good to read a haiku. I tried my hand at one, and it literally takes a lot of skill to write a great haiku. Needless to say that even I didn't like what I wrote. So it's not like everyone can write a good haiku just because it's a short poem. It's very technical kind of thing, and it is a very it's a very pleasurable thing to read a haiku, but not to write usually. Then there is tanka, which is another Japanese poem. It is no longer than a haiku. When it was westernized, it was broken to lines, and it had a 57577 syllable structure. What a syllable structure is again a very long topic, a very elaborative one. So you might not be knowing about syllables, then just leave it aside. If you know, it's well and good. You can always go into it more deeply. If you want to know and you do not know, then go for some research on it. You can just Google the term. You will know the basics of syllables. Then tanka is not popular as haiku, but poets do write it. For example, subtle hints of spring in the wet bark of the tree. Dew dripping from leaves, then runs down the rustled trunk, pools around the roots, and is drunk. It is very short again, but it's very meaningful and impactful again, I should say, because Japanese poetry writing is again a very talented and very skillful thing to do. So it's very difficult to write a tanka as well, similar to the haiku problem. Then we have pantoum. A lot of lines are repeated in it, yet you can make use of puns and such like and have a word play. The pattern in each stanza is where the second and fourth line of each verse is repeated as the first and third of the next. You will find it very complicated over here, but once I'll give you the example, it will be easy for you. The pattern changes in a pantoum thought for the last stanza to the first and third line are the second and fourth of the stanza. It's penultimate. Now you'll understand it, don't worry, when you will be reading this example. I'll just read it to you. As I walk by the riverside, ripples disturb the water. Fish dart upstream, fighting against the flow. Ripples disturb the water. Second line is repeated again at the fifth place. Then we have the fifth one. Struggling to their destination, fighting against the flow. Fourth one again. In their underwater world, struggling to their destination. Fifth again. Fish dart upstream. Third again. In their underworld water. Sixth again. As I walk by the riverside. First again. It starts and ends with the same line. That is the beauty of a pantoum. And trust me, there are lots of more poetry writing forms and you can always go on reading them and understanding them. But what is important is you first understand what poetry is. You should understand that poetry is about flow. And if you maintain the flow, as long as you are in the flow, it's not important what kind of syllables you have or what kind of poetry form it is. Because I recommend myself that when I was writing poetry initially, it was simply free verse. Initially I used to force rhyme, I used to literally force rhyme, bringing out words which were rhyming and which didn't make a sense in my poem, and it was literally very catastrophic to read them now, because I find it very embarrassing reading those poems where I used to force rhyme forcefully. It's not good to force rhyme. Whatever comes into your mind, just throw it out of your mouth and write it on the piece of paper, because that is what is important. Flow is the most important concept of poetry writing. So do not force yourself into rhyming things, going for AB rhyme scheme every time. It doesn't happen. Because whatever you are thinking, it is not bound by rhyme. So do not force a rhyme scheme. Again, I'm reminding, it's a humble request. Please do not force. Then we have, as with poetry writing forms, there are a lot of poetry writing terms also, like hyperbole, personification, metaphor, inversion, simile, onomatopoeia, alliteration, enjambment, and these are just few of them. Now I'll be giving them a description in the next part of this lesson. For example, we have hyperbole. You can say exaggeration in prose, but when it comes to poetry, there's a term for it which is known as hyperbole, especially for exaggeration. So when Wordsworth says, referring to daffodils in the famous Daffodils poem, that 10,000 saw I at a glance, he is using hyperbole. Because if that's true, I've yet to hear it. But with skills in wordplay, the poem can become better if this is used with caution. You can always create a great imagery in the mind of the readers, because whenever we read this 10,000 saw I at a glance, we'll think of a field which is full of daffodils. We're not literally going to count 10,000, but it means that there are ample amount of daffodils in that place. So it's enough to exaggerate our imagination. This one sentence is enough to bring us into a world of daffodils. So this is what hyperbole is about, making the reader imagine things through exaggeration. And exaggeration in poetry is again hyperbole. Then we have personification. This is my again personal favorite, because if you can give a human or a living quality to a non-living being, then you are using this figure of speech named as personification, because you write as if the non-living thing is a person. Okay, so personification is, I just mentioned, it's my favorite poetry writing term. And one more thing, that poetry writing terms are also called figures of speech. So if you hear somewhere saying, some people saying figures of speech, then do not confuse it, because it's almost equivalent to poetry writing terms. Example of personification: the bus shook itself and gave an important horn. So the bus is a non-living thing, it cannot shake itself. So it's a personification. It is said as if the bus is a living thing, which it is not. So it's a personification again. Next, we have a metaphor. A metaphor is a figure of speech that uses one thing to mean another and makes a comparison between the two. Now, he has a special place in my life. The life is not a bed, or life is not a house in which you have a place for someone. It's just a metaphor to say that he has a special significance in his life or her life. So this is a metaphor. Then again, he said, like, they have another sentence which says he followed in his father's footsteps. So that doesn't mean he literally followed his father's footsteps, that wherever his father leads, he just follows him. It's not literally. It simply means that whatever the way father does, the same way the son does. That's important. The meaning behind it is important rather than the words which are used to express the meaning. Then we have inversion. Poetry often makes use of inverting the sentence structure. This is known as inversion. For example, taking a previous example, I would say the daffodils one, 10,000 saw I at a glance. This is not prose. It is not correct. It's wrong. The correct version would be I saw 10,000 at a glance. But again, this is poetry. You have the poetic license. You can invert things and make them more impactful, more influencing. That is poetry again. Then we have similes. Simile means directly comparing one thing with another. The words like and as are used frequently in a simile. For example, he's like a rock compares the person with a rock in a direct manner. Simile can paint pictures in our mind, and hence it is used a lot in poetry. It is the most used device in poetry. Then we have alliteration. We learn by example. So let's have more of them. Like we can say, in the soft summer cold was the sun. The sound of S is repeated for a poetical rhythm and pressure and pleasure as well. So this is called alliteration, where a single sound of the syllable is repeated again and again. That's simile. That's alliteration, I'm sorry. Then we have onomatopoeia. The rain pitter patters, the twig snaps, the sheep baa-baas. These are onomatopoeia because the actual sound of these things resembles the word we have assigned for them. The sheep literally says no, ba. So we have given the word only, babas. So it becomes onomatopoeia. This is onomatopoeia. Fine. Then we have enjambment. This is the breaking of a syntactic unit by the end of a line or between the two verses. The term is directly borrowed by a French enjambment, which means straddling or bestriding. That's important. Now, the best way to master anything, I would say, is to practice it. Okay, I'm sure I've missed some poetry writing terms, and there are lots of things in my mind. Like, I would give you a homework. Think about the term assonance and give me example of assonance in the comment section. I'll wait for them. Assonance, you can Google it or you can search on Wikipedia. You'll find lots of references to assonance. If you know it already, well and good. I would love reading your examples. Now, poetry writing skills is something which you can practice and then master. So go, write poetry. Let it be bad, let it be unreadable. Just write. As long as you're writing, that's important. And that's all I'm trying to tell you. But this type of information, which I've already given you, it will be helpful later. So be sure to store it up in your mind for future use. Now it's over to you. Share your experience on poetry writing. And is there anything I missed mentioning in this gigantic lesson? Be sure to share it in the comment section. And thanks. Rate, review, recommend, and share the lessons. Have a nice time.